Okay, well now we've had some background about the book of Proverbs, how it is structured, how it grew over time, why it's associated with Solomon, some influences from other cultures. During the remainder of our evening, I'd like us to look at some actual passages in the book of Proverbs. Let's go back to chapter 1. We already saw the first verse is a title. That title probably was part of this collection, chapters 1 through 9, before that collection was added. But once it was added, there's a sense in which that first verse does supply as a title for the entire book. And so the entire book became thought to be written by Solomon. If you glance down at verse 7, you get an important statement. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. This is a statement which reappears a couple more times in the book of Proverbs. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And that phrase, fear of the Lord, appears in other books within the wisdom literature collection. So it's an important phrase. But unfortunately, the way that it's translated into English can give you a wrong impression. Fear, in ordinary speech in English, usually means being afraid of. They're not saying that the beginning of wisdom is being afraid that God's going to get you. What they mean by fear is not so much fear as respect. Awe. Awe is a very good translation. And I wish that they would do that in English. I think this is a holdover from the old King James Version when they use fear. But really, awe of God is the beginning of wisdom. Isn't that true? I've found that true in my own life. Let's move on up to, I want to point out that verse to you. And that verse, I think, has been put right here near the beginning as a kind of thesis statement for the whole book. This is kind of foundational for wisdom. Whatever else you may learn as you peruse the Proverbs, it's all going to flow off your back like water unless you've got the beginning of wisdom, which is awe of God. Let's move to chapter 7, which is one of my favorite chapters in the book of Proverbs. Not so much because of its content or its subject matter. I just think it's very well written. And as a former English professor, I always appreciate that. It's so rare. Let's take a look. My child, I'm at chapter 7, verse 1. Keep my words and store up my commandments with you. Keep my commandments and live. Keep my teachings as the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers. Write them on the tablet of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call insight your intimate friend, that they may keep you from the loose woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words. So all of this is a kind of rhetorical flourish by means of which to introduce what he really wants to talk to his son about, which is watch out for prostitutes. Verse 6. Now he could just say watch out for prostitutes, and he could repeat that in various ways. But instead, he does a very clever thing, in my opinion. He dramatizes it. He causes his son to see, to picture in his mind a scenario. Verse 6. For at the window of my house, I looked out through my lattice, kind of like Venetian blinds, and I saw among the simple ones, I observed among the youths, a young man without sense, passing along the street near her corner. taking the boat to her house in the twilight, in the evening, at the time of night and darkness. Now, presumably he's making this up in order to make a point to his son. He's not necessarily saying that every detail that has actually happened. So let's assume that he could have chosen twilight, or he could have chosen sunrise or high noon. Why twilight? Why is that especially appropriate? Well, number one, you work during the day and you play at night, right? So it kind of makes sense that if the boy is going to go with the prostitute, it's going to be at dusk. But I think there's also the intimation of darkness as sin coming upon him, just as darkness is falling upon the landscape. A woman comes toward him, decked out like a prostitute, widely apart. She is loud and wayward. Her feet do not stay at home. Now in the street, now in the squares, and at every corner, she lies in wait. She seizes him and kisses him, and with impudent face, she says to him, "I had to offer sacrifices, and today I paid my vows." So now I've come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly, and I found you. I have decked my couch with coverings, colored spreads of Egyptian linen. Well, there's a come on time. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love until morning. Let us delight ourselves with love. For my husband is dead. He has gone on a long journey. He took a bag of money with him. He will not come home until full moon. With much seductive speech, she persuades him. With her smooth talk, she compels him. Right away, he follows her. Remember, this isn't a simpleton, right? Young man without sin. Right away, he follows her and goes like an ox to the slaughter, or bounds like a stag towards the trap until an arrow pierces its entrails. He is like a bird rushing into a snare, not knowing that it will cost him his life. Interesting series of animal metaphors here. You have the ox, the stag, the bird. And now, my children, listen to me, and be attentive to the words of my mouth. Do not let your hearts turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. For many are those she has laid low, and numerous are her victims. Her house is the way to Sheol, going down to the chambers of death. The next chapter also has a very important passage. I think that chapter 7 is good for the way in which it's written in such a vivid fashion. But the next chapter is more theologically important. In fact, the next chapter is one of the most frequently referred to in the book of Proverbs. In this chapter, we find wisdom personified. Personification is when you attribute human characteristics to a non-human thing. So if I'm talking to the moon, what's the fellow I want with the long nose? No. Cyrano de Bergerac. Remember when he was talking to the moon? If I'm addressing the moon, then I say, "Oh moon, yada yada yada. How white is your face," or whatever. Then I'm attributing human characteristics to an inanimate object as a personification. That's what's going on here. Wisdom is personified. And the wisdom that's being personified here is not human wisdom, but God's wisdom. In a way, all human wisdom is a on your fingers. Say to wisdom, you are my sister. Call insight your intimate friend. That's obviously talking about the Son gathering wisdom. Nevertheless, there's an intimate connection between God's wisdom, which has permeated the world, since after all God has created everything, and human wisdom, which gleans from the universe what knowledge we are able to gather. So there's a connection between God's wisdom and our wisdom. God's wisdom is put into the universe, and our wisdom is derived from study of the universe. Go to chapter 8, verse 22. There's a very famous poem where personified wisdom is not only depicted as a human being, but depicted with human characteristics, but wisdom is also the speaker of this poem. Now, if you're an ancient Jew and you want to personify wisdom, and you want to personify not just wisdom, but God's wisdom, wisdom as it resides in God himself, are you going to make wisdom a male or a female? Female. Female. That's absolutely right. Why?
Because God is male, so he likes every other species.
That makes sense to me, and I suspect that's part of the reason. If God is male, and you're going to depict his wisdom as sort of a person alongside of God, God's own wisdom is a person distinct from him to some extent, then the obvious thing to do is like a consort or something, a female. And I suspect that was part of it. I suspect part of it too, and probably the main reason, is that the word wisdom in Hebrew is feminine. In Hebrew, nouns are either masculine or feminine. And the word chokmah in Hebrew, which is wisdom, happens to be a feminine noun. So that too would have caused them automatically to think of wisdom in feminine terms. So, in verse 22 of chapter 8, we have God's own wisdom, personified as a woman, speaking. And she's speaking about what it was like back when God created the world. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago I was set up, at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. When he had not yet made earth and fields, or the world's first bits of soil. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep. Has anybody ever seen that painting? I believe it's by William Blake. It shows God, who is a naked male with white hair and a white beard, and he's kind of down on one knee. And he's leaning down with a compass in his hand, not north, south, east, west, but the two-prong type compass. And he's drawing a circle. You've seen that? Where did you see that? In the book. Okay. I'd like to trace that picture someday, because I found it very impressive. Am I right that it's William Blake? Am I right that the painter was William Blake? You know. I think so, yeah. Anyway, Blake got that idea from this verse, which is, or whoever it was. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep. What are we at, 28? When he made firm the skies above. When he established the fountains of the deep. When he assigned to the sea its limits, so that the waters might not transgress his command. When he marked out the foundations of the earth, then was I beside him, like a master worker. and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the human race. That's kind of an important passage. Here you have wisdom depicted as kind of like a contractor in relation to an architect. It's like God has the ideas about how to do creation, but wisdom is out there joyously dabbling in it and doing it. That last couple of verses, I was beside him like a master worker. What do you guys have for that? Craftsman. Okay. And I was daily his delight, and I was rejoicing before him always. You get a sense for the ebullience of God in the act of creation. And God delights in his wisdom at the same time that God's wisdom delights in the humanity that he has just created. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think there's a purpose in putting this feminine portrait of wisdom right after this feminine description of a prostitute to make a contrast?
I've heard
Because
that.
there's a lot of similarity between the two women. Well, wisdom personified and
A lot of contrast.
a lot of contrast.
I agree. That's an interesting point. And I suspect that's probably got something to do with the placement here. But actually, if you go on into the next chapter, it continues to talk about wisdom. Chapter 9, verse 1, wisdom has built her house.
Isn't that really the first place where you can really say, man, all the rest of these men, it's not
As far as wisdom, well, wisdom is...
everything you've been reading up until this point, how do you say female?
In chapter 8, it's she and her. Verses 2.
And I suspect, although I don't recall precisely, that wisdom is probably personified in a handful of verses in the earlier chapters also. It's a fairly common thing to happen.
I think it's like you said before, because wisdom is a female word. So if I was going to say wisdom in Spanish, it will be female. It's sabiduría, but they have sabiduría. That's not female.
La, yeah, right.
French is the same way.
Sure. Even in English, cities are always female, boats are always female. Yeah.
It's like when people say snake. When I say snake, in Spanish, it's la culebra. It is female.
Mm-hmm.
And then people here say, I need to go to female.
Yeah, take the word.
Right. But to get back to your question, I think there's probably a certain amount of contrast intended between chapter 7 and chapter 8. But if you go on into chapter 9, you find a female figure described who's more exactly a contrast with personified wisdom. And this female figure, although she's not specifically called Dame Folly, has traditionally been referred to as Dame Folly. That's the name that's given to her. If you go to 9:13, the foolish woman is loud, she is ignorant and knows nothing. She sits at the door of her house, on a seat at the high places of the town, calling to those who pass by, who are going straight on their way. You who are simple, turn in here. And to those without sense, she says, stolen water is sweet, and bread in secret is heaven. But they do not know that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. It even ends similar to that description of the adulteress in chapter 7. But the fact that she's calling passerbys in to lure them so that they can partake of her secret knowledge, which is not wisdom at all, makes her a direct contrast with the good kind of female wisdom at the beginning of chapter 8, There you have the statement, does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights, beside the way, at the crossroads, she takes her stand. Beside the gate, in front of the town, at the entrance of the portal, she cries out, O simple ones, learn prudence, etc. So I think the more direct contrast is with Dame Folly, who comes after feminine wisdom, although there is also a contrast with the adultery.
There we have temptation.
Yeah.
And then we go to the next thing, temptation, the female.
I don't know the Hebrew word for it, but...
Salvación.
Right. And I would assume probably that's true.
The wisdom and the intention of wisdom of the woman is temptation.
That makes sense. Let's try taking a look at chapter 10. These are probably, among all the psalm collections that comprise the book of Proverbs, these are probably among the earliest. They seem to have pre-exilic interests. We know that the Davidic line of kings that was founded by David in 1000 continued on for several centuries, so that his son Solomon became king, Solomon's son became king, that son, that one's son, that one's son, all the way down for 400 years. There was always a descendant of David on the throne of Israel. In 587, the Babylonians captured the king of Israel and dragged him off to Babylon, and he died there a few years later. So this is the end of the Davidic monarchy. The monarchy only existed prior to the Babylonian exile. Because these proverbs make references to the monarchy as if it were still existing, that's a good indication that we're dealing with fairly early collection here. Proverbs that go all the way back up into the period of the monarchy. So let's just take a look at this collection. What sorts of things do you get in chapter 10? Chapter 10, verse 1. A wise child makes a glad father, but a foolish child is a mother's grief. Do you recall the first evening when we were talking about characteristics of Hebrew poetry? We talked about parallelism. Here's a good example of parallelism. Back then we said that there were three types of parallelism. One was synonymous, where you say something and then you say it again. What's that saying from the Psalms? The heavens declare the glory of God, and the earth shows forth his glory. Well, that's basically the same thing said over and over again. Creation glorifies God. It's just said with slightly different words in each time. That's synonymous. The second type was antithetic parallelism. That's where you say one thing, and then you say a similar idea, but you use a but, and you use a contrasting concept. You use the opposite of it to help make the same point. That's what we have here. This is antithetic parallelism. And then there's this third type called synthetic parallelism, which simply means you have one sentence broken into two lines. It's not really parallelism, but it's still a couplet. Chapter 10 contains mostly antithetic couplets. The first one was, a wise child makes a glad father, but a foolish child is a mother's grief. The second one says, treasures gained by wickedness do not profit, but righteousness delivers from death. Is that antithetic? It's inculcating the same message in both lines, but there is the but, and it is contrasting treasures gained by wickedness versus righteousness. The third one is, the Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. Antithetic. Yeah.
Double retribution.
Thank you. I was just going to point that out. Remember at the beginning of the evening I said that the book of Proverbs basically has the old-time optimistic kind of teaching in it. Here are Proverbs from somewhere during the monarchy period of monarchy. And so, of course, they're going to present double retribution theory, because the questioning of the double retribution theory mostly begins after the trauma of the Babylonian exile. A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. That's basically talking about being industrious. A child who gathers in summer is prudent, but a child who sleeps in harvest brings shame. That's basically talking about not being lazy. Blessings are on the head of the righteous, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. That's basically giving us a contrast between the righteous versus the wicked. Same with the next one. The memory of the righteous is a blessing, but the name of the wicked will rob.
That's the opposite of Shakespeare. The evil that men do lives after them, the good is oft interred with their bones.
Good point. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That's interesting. Are these proverbs arranged in any particular order? The first one is a statement about children and parents. The second one is talking about stealing, really, treasures gained by wickedness. The next one is talking about
Commandments.
reward and punishment. They all sort of have to do with the commandments. I really don't see much particular order. Why do we have stealing and then later on laziness? Couldn't we have had laziness and then later on stealing? In the next chapter you do. So the point I'm trying to get across to you is that this is a hodgepodge. There really isn't a lot of sense in the collocation of the Proverbs. Various scholars have tried to find some kind of pattern or system going on here. And a lot of times you'll find that in the original Hebrew, some word at the end of one couplet, proverb, will sound similar to a word at the beginning of the next couplet. So probably the guys who created these collections expected that their students, whom they call their sons, are going to memorize these, and therefore they use mnemonic devices to help them learn it and so on. But as far as trying to find a group that all have to do with stealing put together, or all have to do with laziness put together, you don't find that. They're all intermingled in a complete hodgepodge, pretty much. Occasionally you'll find 3 or 4 together that deal with one topic, but that's fairly rare. What are the principal topics that you find being dealt with in the book of Proverbs? Well, we've already seen a few. I decided to answer that question myself, just to get an idea of exactly what are the principal concerns of those who created the Proverbs. So I went through, and every verse, starting with chapter 10, verse 1, I wanted to use this early set. I went through and assigned a topic to every single one of them, like stealing, laziness, whatever. And I pooped out by chapter 19. I could do it from there. So, but I did do it that far. What is that? 10, 11, 10 chapters. Okay, so that's a sizable sample. What do they call that? Sample size? Yeah, okay. The results I have reproduced for you on the last page. Just to give you an idea of the sorts of things that are of concern to these people. Overwhelmingly, the absolute number one topic that they talk about is a contrast between the just and the wicked. The examples we've already come across are the first one. A wise child makes a glad father, but a foolish child is a mother's grief. Or, blessings are on the head of the righteous, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence. It's simply contrasting the righteous and the foolish. That happens over and over and over again. Surprisingly, the second most common topic was speech, with a lot of advice in there about keeping your mouth shut. Interestingly enough, speech is also one of the principal topics in Amenemot's collection. If you go look at the original Egyptian work that has come down to us, and that work is not part of my sample here. That comes later in the book of Proverbs. So apparently speech was a very important topic to them. Speech continues to be an important topic in the wisdom tradition. We normally don't think of the wisdom tradition as extending on beyond the Old Testament. But actually it does. The wisdom tradition flows on down into the New Testament. Just to give you an example, don't bother flipping to it, but I want to read you a quick excerpt from the book of James in the New Testament. Here's a statement about speech in the book of James, chapter 3. All of us make many mistakes. Anyone who makes no mistakes in speaking is perfect, able to keep the whole body in check with a bridle. If we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we guide their whole bodies. Or look at ships. Though they are so large that it takes strong winds to drive them, yet they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So it is with the tongue. The tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great exploits. How great a forest is set ablaze by a small fire, and the tongue is a fire. The tongue is placed among their members as a world of iniquity. It stains the whole body. It sets on fire the cycle of nature. It is itself set on fire by hell. For every species of beast and bird, of reptile and sea creature, can be tamed and has been tamed by the human species, but no one can tame the tongue. And on and on and on. So the concerns of the wisdom literature in the Old Testament flow on into wisdom writing in the New Testament. Notice, for example, the last item here is anxiety. Now, there's only 3 verses out of those 7 books, but you find other passages concerning the bad effects of anxiety and how you should relax and not let yourself be anxious in other wisdom literature outside the book of Proverbs. Well, what do you find in Jesus' sayings? He also said something important about anxiety. This is Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6. Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap, nor gather into barns, yet their heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they? And on and on and on. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring worries of its own. Jesus lived in a Jewish culture. And Jesus read the Jewish scriptures. Jesus was a inheritor of the wisdom literature tradition. And the wisdom literature tradition has to some extent shaped Jesus' way of speaking and way of thinking. So that some of the concerns and even some of the turns of phrase that you find in the wisdom literature show up also in Jesus' sayings. Other concerns that you find here are a contrast between the wise and the foolish, quite a lot about how to handle money, riches, a fair number on laziness. One of my favorites on laziness appears in chapter 6 of Proverbs. Chapter 6, verse 6. Go to the ant, you lazy bones. Consider its ways and be wise. Without having any chief or officer or ruler, it prepares its food in summer and gathers its sustenance in harvest. How long will you lie there, you lazy bones? When will you rise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed lord. Okay, so these are some of the typical concerns that you find in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is mostly full of conventional wisdom. This other strand in the wisdom literature, which is the kind of questioning, pessimistic attitude, is very rare in the book of Proverbs. In fact, the only passage I know of is those sayings of Agur. Where was Agur? Chapter 30. Take a look at his sayings. Chapter 30, verses 1 to 4. Thus says the man, meaning Agur, I am weary, O God. I am weary, O God. How can I prevail? Surely I am too stupid to be human. I do not have human understanding. I have not learned wisdom, nor have I knowledge of the holy ones. Who has ascended to heaven and come down? Who has gathered the wind in the hollow of the hand? Who has wrapped up the waters in a garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is the person's name? Anybody know? God. Right? Who has gathered the wind in the hollow of his hand? Who has wrapped up the waters in the garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? Gotta be God, right? What is the person's name, and what is the name of the person's child? Surely you know. It's interesting that it ends with surely you know. From there on out, you're back to conventional wisdom. Don't be lazy, don't steal, etc. Because in Job, we had those two speeches by Yahweh. Toward the end of Job, remember when God shows up in a whirlwind and he says, tighten your belt, buddy, because I'm going to ask you some questions. And then he says, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined the earth's measurements? Surely you know it. Remember that? There's obviously some connection between Job and Agur, but Agur is so mysterious as a person, and his sayings are so brief, that it's hard to tell what exactly is going on here. But even the phrasing is similar. So I assume that Agur is a representative somehow of the questioning, pessimistic type of attitude. Lemuel's sayings, as being in the 31, are exactly what you would expect his mother to tell him. 31 begins by saying, the words of King Lemuel that his mother taught him. No, my son. No, son of my womb. No, son of my bowels. Do not give your strength to women. Your ways to those who destroy kings. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to desire strong drink. Or else they will drink and forget what has been decreed, and will pervert the rights of the afflicted. Give strong drink to one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty, and remember their misery no more. Speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of all the destitute. Speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Good mother, huh? Wise advice. This brings us to the remainder of chapter 31, which I promised we would look at. This is a poem describing the ideal wife. You know, you said that there ought to be one for the ideal husband. It occurred to me during break why there isn't one. There is no ideal husband, All right, well, let's see. Well, okay. Sure. Let's see what the ideal wife was conceived like. This is probably written somewhere around this period. It's post-exilic, because pre-exilic you don't get long poems for the most part. You just get those little couplets. The long poems usually are written after the exile. So this is written 300, 400 BC. Here's what it says. A capable wife, who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wood and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from far away. She rises while it is still night and provides food for her household and tasks for her servant girls. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. She girds herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor, and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid for her household when it snows, for all her household are clothed in crimson. She makes herself coverings. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the city gates, taking his seat among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She supplies the merchants with sashes. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household, and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her happy. Her husband too, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain. But a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her a share in the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the city gates. Into the book of Proverbs. Why do you suppose they put that poem at the end? Why not put it back there when they were talking about these other women? I think the guy wanted to honor his wife. Some fellow that wrote this poem added it to a copy of the book of Proverbs, and it came out since then. She's an admirable woman, although he seems a little especially focused upon the idea she's going to make him money. But it also ends with a reference to fear of the Lord, which we had also seen as kind of a thesis statement at the beginning. And it also provides a human instance of wisdom to contrast with the divine personification wisdom that we saw previously. I think it's well placed there. Marguerite gave me permission to mention that I'm going to be giving a speech next week. Which I'd like to invite any of you to if you'd like to attend. Although I understand you're having a mission here, and that's certainly worthwhile. But I'm going to be giving a lecture next week at the University of St. Thomas on the search for the original Bible, the title of the talk. How do we know that the words we've got here match what was originally written by the author, because we don't have any copies of the original anymore? So I'm going to be talking about the process that scholars go through to establish what was originally written. And one of the things I'll be talking about especially is the Dead Sea Scrolls. It'll be kind of an introduction to the Dead Sea Scrolls as part of my talk. So you're more than welcome to come. It's at 7:30 next Wednesday night in Jones Hall. Just if you wind up on campus, ask for Jones and you'll be directed. University of St. Thomas is Montrose and Alabama.